So Tom, last week I was reading an article, a little commentary by Dennis Prager, and it was on a topic that I found somewhat interesting, that I've always found somewhat interesting, and that is, where were the average Germans during World War II and the Holocaust?
Goodness.
Or where were the average Russians during Lenin and Stalin, or the average Chinese under Mao?
Yeah.
There's going to be people on the extremes in every case. There's going to be people who just, it's the idea that Woodrow Wilson really capitalized on, the leader, right? Who just love the leader, right?
Yeah.
There's an old Simpsons episode about Homer joining a cult, and he says, he starts chanting, "I love the leader." But this whole thing about, there's always going to be that extreme group who says, Hitler is so brilliant and amazing and smart, and I want to follow him.
We drank the Kool-Aid. We're sold. We're in.
Right.
We're following this guy to Armageddon.
Right. And then on the other end, there's the people who are just, I am strong against him, and I'm going to be out there. And if I'm Jewish and out there against Hitler, I'm probably going to be killed.
Right.
And then there were those who had to hide and everything else. But there was this huge group in the middle.
I suspect in most great tyrannies, great just mean large, massive, sprawling, totalitarian tyrannies in the modern period, if you were to plot their populations in terms of a bell curve, you're probably talking about the two little tails there. The people who violently, strongly resist, and the people who are totally in, who whether you want to call them brainwashed or however you want to describe them, they're in, they're going to follow the leader. And the great big middle fat part of the curve, it's a whole lot of people there who not real sure, just kind of want to be left alone.
Right. In that spirit of left alone, you start asking yourself, where were they to stand up to Hitler in the 30s when he was beginning his rise to power? Where were they under Lenin and Stalin? And we can go back further and further, right? I mean, this is not a modern phenomena. But in that sense, Dennis Prager got really into comparing that to the average American today. And the person who's sitting there and saying, I don't really know. I hear my passionate conservative friends on one side saying, we have national debt issues, we have a government overreach, we have all of these problems, we have to stop this. And these are some people who had some critiques of Trump.
They're right.
Well, they are, right? And some of them had some reasonable critiques of Trump, right? Yep. They're not saying he is my leader and I'm going to follow him to Armageddon and anything else. But there were also, for those people, there were reasons to support Trump. There were things that he did really well. And then on the other side, there are people who say, no, we can keep printing money and borrowing money and we're going to be fine, and let's just keep growing the government because the government has to provide safety and security and well-being for all of its citizens.
They also, that other side, they also pose great dangers, right? They say global climate is going to swamp the world and economic inequality is going to fuel devastating civil wars, and so they too draw out this very scary picture of the future unless we do what they're telling us to do.
And so Prager's point is you have these two groups, and you've got this big group of people in the middle. Those two are probably the long tail on both ends of that bell curve. And you've got all these people in the middle who are hearing it from both sides, and they don't really know what to think, what to believe, where to go. And Prager's point was, it's hard to imagine those people in the middle gravitating towards the side that is being condemned by the media on a daily basis, that is being condemned by social media and big tech on a daily basis, that since the 1940s has been called fascists inappropriately, since FDR and all the way through, that is constantly facing impeachment every time they're in office, and that is being silenced on a regular basis. And it's not hard to understand why the average American, just like probably the average German, right? Remember what Hitler did. The first thing he did was took control of the media. And these people are hearing things, and they're not hearing both sides. And it's hard for people to really sit there and say, I still want to understand this side when just overwhelmingly the people who they have known their entire life to be the arbiters of truth, let's say, whether it's a judge in the Ninth Circuit, or whether it's the media. You know, we've always taken, I think about my parents, their commitment to shows like 60 Minutes, where they thought, I'm learning something every time I watch this, and I'm learning something about the world. And I've had times where my mom has turned to me and said, if I can't watch the news anymore to learn this stuff, where do I go? Yeah. What do I do? She has opened up her mind over the last 5 or 10 years to, there is a whole other side to this political debate, but she doesn't know where to look, and she doesn't know where to go. And it's a really difficult thing.
Well,
and so,
until now, she looks to the Vino Veritas Society.
She does. Yeah. She does. And it's been our conversations and everything else. But
you're certainly right. I would use the word disbelief. There's a strong propensity. I think woven into human nature. I don't think this is a cultural thing. I think this is a human thing that cuts across cultures. You were born into some kind of regime, some kind of way of life, some kind of political entity. You see how things work and how they go. And there's this strong propensity to not believe terrible stories you hear about your own government.
Right.
Those have to be exaggerated. That can't really actually be happening. I suspect, I don't know this with certainty. I suspect, just what I know about human nature, there were probably a lot of Germans in the 1930s saying to themselves, "Oh, come on." They're hearing rumors, certain camps are being built, and they're trucking away large numbers of people, including Jews and others. And I bet a lot of Germans say, oh, come on.
Right.
What are you, some kind of conspiracy wacko, right? That can't really be happening.
And especially when you hear from somebody who doesn't necessarily have, you and I don't know what the conversations going on inside the Oval Office are like.
Right.
We have no idea what the government intelligence is and all of that kind of stuff. And meanwhile, we say those things and we're just citizens. Mm-hmm. Whereas the media, the people they've been listening to their entire life is saying, those people are all conspiracy-based wackos. They don't know what they're talking about. This is all made up. There's a real threat here, and the real threat is those people. Mm-hmm. And you need to listen to us. And if you've been listening to the media your whole life, whether it's newspapers, whether it's books, whether it's radio, now television and the internet, I mean, as media has evolved, you're going to likely trust the media over just some random person who doesn't have access. And not to go too far on that tangent, but there's a whole other conversation to be had about the studies into how the media has affected who gets elected president, right? We can go back to FDR doing things on radio. We can go back to Nixon and JFK doing one of the first television-based debates and how awful Nixon looked. He was sweating and uncomfortable, and JFK was just smooth and calm and collected. And a lot of people say that's why he won.
By the way, this is a little detour, but I just want to put out there for our listeners to know there's a real discussion happening right now among Democrats to revive an old federal policy. It used to be called the Fairness Doctrine that came out of Congress during the New Deal. This goes all the way back to the 1930s. Remember, this is when radio was just really taking off. This was a new technology to communicate to huge numbers of people across airwaves. You don't even need to run lines or wires, right? Roosevelt was so angered and so perturbed that there were these crusty, conservative, patriotic constitutionalists who were criticizing him. They were daring to go on the radio and challenge some of the things Roosevelt and the other New Dealers are saying. So Congress passes the Fairness Doctrine, and basically what they do, they use a new agency was created, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission,
right,
which licenses, we've had a lot of talk about professional licensure and how government can use that. This is exactly what they did. You want to broadcast, a radio transmission, you have to be licensed by the federal government, and they use those licenses to say, if you want to keep your license, you better not be critical of the government. Or if you air anything political, meaning critical of the government, you have to give equal time, right, to airing these other things. And so most radio stations thought, I can't do all that. So they just shut up. They just started, this is the when we start getting FM radio and all music stations, we'll just play music, right? We're not going to talk about it. But here was the one rub. Under the terms of the Fairness Doctrine and how it was implemented by the FCC, Roosevelt himself would give these speeches. They were called fireside chats. And he would talk directly to millions of Americans. And the FCC said to all the radio stations, you must air that because that is public and necessary information. And that is, get this, that is not political because that's the president. Right. And the president is part of the government. And the government is here to look after us and take care of us. So that's not political. Not only may you air that, you must air that. And you don't have to give any opposing views to that or anything like that. The whole concept of the Fairness Doctrine was made to make life easy for Democrats. And I, for one, I actually think it's no coincidence that for 4 decades when the Fairness Doctrine was in place, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives continuously for 40 years with no interruption. Anyway, back.
So the whole thing here is there are there are a lot of people sort of in the middle that are they're not sure what to believe. They're not sure what to think. They're not sure what's true. They're not sure what's not. They're not sure how to act. Yep. They're not sure were these people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th, who marched into the U.S. Capitol, were they right? Were they wrong?
Yeah. Should we admire
happened?
them or should we scold them?
And at the end of the day, the only solution here is for people to become more virtuous, good citizens. Because once you start focusing on that and you start learning how to think like a virtuous citizen and act like a virtuous citizen and analyze things, you can start doing the job that is necessary both in your actions and how you move forward. And I think that's why we make this one of the center points of the Vino Veritas Society, is because if we are to survive as a free society, we have to be. There isn't we can't. It's not this is a little Yoda moment. Now, I'm not the Star Wars guy, but it's a little moment. There is no try. There's only do. Right? You have to. You can't just try to be a virtuous citizen. You have to invest everything into doing it.
Well, in fact, you started with the piece by Dennis Prager, and let's bring that back in because the comparison he makes. He writes in that piece that he had always been pretty quick to judge, and he didn't really understand how could there have been so many ordinary Germans, right? Not Germans who were part of the government or part of the secret police, just ordinary Germans who seemed to say nothing and do nothing, even though terrible, horrific, murderous injustices were happening right down the street from them. And he says, the same thing about ordinary Russians with the rise of Soviet totalitarianism and ordinary Chinese with the rise of communism under Mao. And here's what Prager says, and this should be a wake-up moment for our members and for fellow citizens. He said, I now understand it better because I'm looking around my own country right now. I've been watching Americans, especially over this last year, and as government has come steamrolling in and expanded its power, its control, shut down things, shut up people, huge numbers of Americans just say nothing. Just say nothing. They don't know what to say, or they're scared to say something, and they're just quiet.
He uses the example of throughout the summer when restaurants, because of lockdowns and shutdowns, forced diners outside. It enabled groups like BLM and Antifa to walk in and walk up to tables and say, put your hand up in support of Black Lives Matter, or we're going to harm you.
Right.
And it led these people out of fear, out of, I don't know what to say, I don't know how to respond.
Right.
And I think, I'm gonna send back to you in a minute the whole question of what are the virtues, since they're part of your book. I'm gonna let you define them. But before we do, I want to emphasize also, I made the point that it's for this middle group to see, who should I listen to and what should I think and how do I analyze things? But it's also for the groups on the extremes. The group on the extreme, the group who went into the Capitol building, were they acting virtuously to set the right example? Because these four virtues are a way to judge people. Martin Luther King, this week was Martin Luther King's birthday. And he talks about judging people by the content of their character.
Right.
The content of their character can be defined in their ability to enact or embrace these four virtues and have the courage to be virtuous. And so for all of these people in the middle, if you want to be judged, that is an appropriate way to judge people's character, to judge them by how virtuous they are. And so that little tale at the end, who did go into the Capitol or who would have gone into the Capitol, think about it as if, and I'm not saying you were wrong, but in that moment, in all of from the beginning to the end, did you act in a virtuous way?
Right.
And it becomes a real important way that we can learn from our fellow human beings, from our fellow citizens, and judge the character of them. So
in fact, I want to add something onto that. We live in an age today where it is not popular, it is not common. In fact, it is considered highly problematic to say anything praiseworthy about the founders. Therefore, I'm going to say something praiseworthy about one of the founders in particular, George Washington, who I consider to be, in many respects, a kind of model of civic virtue. Maybe not the perfect Platonic ideal, but we can learn a lot about what it means to live virtuously by studying the life and the choice and the actions, the behavior of George Washington.
Sure.
And so just a quick test I would put to those people running into the Capitol is your behavior worthy of George Washington? Is that something Washington or his top generals would have done or would have condoned? I think that's an easy way to get to it. The other thing I want to make clear is the Prager piece with which we started draws this contrast to some of the darkest, most terrifying, most unjust moments in world history, these murderous totalitarian tyrannies, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia. And you could look at this a couple of ways when you realize that many of our fellow citizens today are acting like ordinary Germans did in the 1930s or ordinary Russians did in the 1940s and 1950s. And you could say, well, on the one hand, Americans today don't need to stand up and say something because the threat of the American government, our own government, the threat is not as great. It's not as big a deal as the Nazi regime was to the people in Germany or the Soviet regime was to the people in Russia. You could say that, but we could also counter and say, okay, so therefore it's easier to speak up.
Yeah.
Okay, if that's right, if we don't have SS guards on every corner with machine guns monitoring everything, that means it's easier for us to speak up. And if we're not speaking up now, in 2021, but before the country has become a totalitarian police state, if we're not speaking up now, is it more or less likely that ordinary Americans will speak up in the future as we become more of a police state?
Well,
and the answer is less, right? They're going to be less likely because they'll be more at risk.
And they'll be less capable, right? It's the type of thing that you have to practice. You have to get used to. You have to work towards. It's not easy. It's not simple to be virtuous and good.
In fact, let's remind our listeners the Greek root of the word virtue. It goes from the Greek to the Latin to the English. The word virtue. The root of it meant excellence. Right. The virtue of a thing was the excellence. When a thing does what it is supposed to do and it does it in an excellent way. Think of the most beautiful, the fastest, thoroughbred horse. It's just this beautiful, stunning thing to watch it. Its form, when it runs well, it runs fast, right? That's the excellence of a horse. That's what it's supposed to do. Whereas if you see another horse and it's limping around, it can't run.
Right.
Well, what do we say about that horse? Something's wrong. Something appears that's not an excellent horse, right? It's either hurt or it's sick or there's some kind of problem. That idea of virtue, it offers for us a standard at which to aim. If you're a sports guy, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know this. Who as of today, who owns the home run record in Major League Baseball?
I think it's Barry Bonds.
I think you're right.
I think it's Barry Bonds.
I mean, I remember when Sosa and McGuire were going back. I think it's.
But that was single season. Are you talking single season?
Single
season is definitely Barry Bonds.
Barry Bonds. So
if you want to take off any supposed asterisk,
let's not go down rabbit holes. Here's my point. He did set a standard of excellence regarding hitting home runs.
Sure.
If you want to be a baseball player, you want to go to the major leagues. And you have one goal. You say, I want to hit more home runs in a season than anybody else ever. That's my goal. I want to do that. Well, you would be wise to study Barry Bonds and McGuire and Mickey Mantle and Babe Ruth, right? And all the guys who kept bumping that record up and up.
Hank Aaron.
You'd want to see what they did and how they did it, right? That's the level of excellence.
Yep.
Well, that means to achieve virtue, to be excellent at anything, requires work and effort. It's hard. Virtue does not just come naturally to us. We have to work at it, including the moral virtues, including the civic virtues. And that kind of leads us into what we're talking about here is not physical virtue so much, although it might include some of it, but it's really the moral character, the moral virtue of individual citizens.
Right.
What we've done is we've looked at the literature of the founding, the whole design of government, and it is supposed to be, this regime is supposed to be a regime of a very limited government, a government of very limited powers. Today, Americans sort of think of their government as kind of part Santa Claus and part Big Daddy or Big Brother protector watching over us, keeping us safe from everything and everyone else. That wasn't the view of the founders, and that's not the view of the Constitution. It's supposed to be a very limited power in government, a government that has very limited presence in our lives. And the challenge there is, if government is not around, if we don't have Big Brother monitors, right, government watching us in every room and every location, it does make it easier for some citizens to prey upon other citizens,
Sure,
to become predators. And how do you solve that problem? And the founders said, well, there's one way we can solve it while keeping intact this limited constitutional structure, and that is to try to cultivate a certain character on the part of citizens to encourage certain civic virtues. Mm-hmm. And what we've done at the Vino Veritas Society is we've distilled that down into 4 core. It's not everything, but it's sort of the main important virtues that we think all citizens should have. And I'll list them out, and then we'll kind of talk through what they mean and why they're important. Beginning with the idea of self-restraint. Every citizen needs to be able to restrain himself, govern himself, be self-disciplined, self-mastering. In that sense, self-government begins with governing oneself.
Right.
If we as individuals can't control ourselves, then it's going to require something like a big police state, right?
And to your analogy of the baseball player, right, of Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds, I believe, leads Major League Baseball history in another key stat, which is walks.
Interesting.
And what that shows is Barry Bonds knew how to restrain himself. Yeah. He knew when to swing, and when he swung, he was going to hit a home run most of the time, or a significant portion of the time compared to all other baseball players.
Yeah.
And yet he restrained himself to know, I'm not going to swing unless I know I can have a chance of hitting a home run on that pitch.
He wasn't swatting at bad pitches.
Right. He was able to restrain himself. He was able to govern himself by knowing what was good and what was bad.
Yep. So number 1 is self-restraint. The second virtue, and all these virtues they're all connected to each other.
Sure.
When I used to teach Aristotle's, but the greatest book, I argue, the greatest book on morals is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And the 4 kind of cardinal virtues, the key moral virtues, which are in the classical literature, that is justice, courage, wisdom, and temperance, or moderation. And I would tell students that each virtue is contained in the others. Mm-hmm. If you dig into one of them deeply enough, you bump into the others. For example, if you want to be a just person, you want to do justice, and you really dig into what justice requires, well, it's going to require knowing some things. It's going to require some wisdom.
Right.
It's going to require some courage to stand up and do justice, the right thing, when it might not be very popular. And so each virtue is kind of contained in kernel form in the others. Same with these civic virtues. So we have self-restraint, self-assertion,
Right.
willingness to stand up and defend yourself, defend your family, defend your property, defend your rights from all enemies and threats to those rights. Civic knowledge, knowing some basic things about your country, your constitution, your government, what powers have you as a citizen delegated to your government, and what responsibilities do you have for yourself and your loved ones. So there's civic knowledge, and the
to
fourth
add
one,
to that real quick, I think one word you left out that you talk about a lot. This is me just inserting your words. Knowing what your real rights are and what your rights are not.
Yeah.
Right? Civic knowledge is hugely about what are your rights.
Yeah.
You can't just say, I have a right to everything. I have a right to health care. I have a right to education. I have a right to that car because you drive it and I like it.
Well, in fact, let's come back to that, because when we talk about civic knowledge, there's a big discussion there about knowing what rights are really rights, what rights are legit, and what are not.
But the point I should have just jumped straight at was, you have your rights as you talked about them containing in one another.
Yeah.
Your self-restraint and your self-assertion should be based almost entirely on what your actual rights are.
That's right. Absolutely. So we've got self-restraint, self-assertion, civic knowledge, and the fourth is self-reliance. Being productive enough to take care of oneself so that you're not dependent on others or dependent on the government, something like that. And when you boil down all of the literature from the founding, these are themes that keep coming up. Sometimes they're mentioned explicitly, and sometimes it's just the way that they're describing. They're describing either self-restraint, self-assertion, civic knowledge, or self-reliance. And I thought maybe what we could do is just kind of walk through each of these and talk about what they are and why they're important. If you think of examples today, either of these virtues in action or maybe the opposite,
right?
Failures of these, virtues. I think the first one's pretty obvious, right? Self-restraint. In a way, that is one of the first challenges of raising children is self-restraint. It's one of the first lessons. I mean, think of one of the first words kids learn very early. It's right up there with mommy and daddy. No.
Right.
No. And they learn no because they hear it. And the reason they hear it is because their parents are saying no, right?
Right.
Little kid wants to do so, right? Gets near the electrical outlet, shouldn't be, but what does the parent say? No. And you're trying to teach some self-restraint. It's not wise, it's not good to just do anything you feel like doing. And this might be as simple as that notion sounds of self-government. It turns out it's highly controversial today because it kind of flies in the face of our progressive culture, which is do whatever you want, do whatever feels good. The virtue of self-restraint says, no, actually you should develop and practice some self-mastery, some self-discipline. If you do whatever you want to do, you might end up going down some disastrous paths. This is sort of, on a personal level, think of the sad, terrible examples of people who struggled mightily with alcoholism or drug addiction or other kinds of addictive things. They're doing what they feel like doing. The alcoholic feels like drinking, so he drinks and ends up going down this really bad path because he doesn't have that virtue of self-restraint. And this also, I think, reinforces this notion that these virtues, they don't come to us easily. They require some work. They require some practice. If you are used to indulging all of your senses, right, all the time, it's really hard. Anyone who's tried to go on some kind of diet, right?
Yeah.
Who has eaten really poorly, poor eating habits their whole life, and they get too heavy, they get unhealthy. Maybe sometimes it's medical reasons. Okay, I got to change my eating habits. It's hard. Because they've never done that. They've never exercised, self-restraint.
And they
way.
know how good some of those things are.
Yeah.
They know they're bad for you, but they've always made the choice to say, I know it's bad for me, but it's so good. I want to choose the good, the fun, the easy. And some of it has to come through experience, right? You talk about kids and the parent saying, don't stick your finger in the socket. Well, there's a line, right? There's that line of a parent has to say no to certain things because those certain things could kill the child. Right? Kid gets electrocuted, could stop their heart, could kill them. On the other hand, there are those things that parents don't necessarily say no to because they need the kid to learn.
Yeah.
They need the kid to experience. You touch the hot stove one time, you're never going to do it again, right? Because you understand, you start to recognize, I need to restrain myself. That's going to hurt.
Right.
I'm not just cerebrally telling myself I probably shouldn't do that, because you always have that kind of curiosity. Well, what would happen if I actually did? Until you know what a burn feels like, what that pain is. So the self-restraint, the self-governance, I think is an obvious one, but I don't think people really think about the extent to which it plays in our lives from the day we're born all the way through.
All the way through. And it's especially important as fellow citizens. We've been talking mainly about examples that involve people lacking self-restraint in ways that do harm to themselves. But if we teach generations of fellow citizens, you don't need to be restrained. Go do whatever you want to do. One citizen might say, well, what I want to do is just drink myself into oblivion. Okay. But the other might say, well, I want to go take what my neighbor has. That's what I want to do. Or I want to go, I want to go assault or rape or murder other people. That's what I feel like doing. I have an appetite. I have a desire to do that. This is one of the great challenges in living in an age of moral relativism and nihilism. So many people assume, well, there really is no right and wrong. This is all highly subjective. The founders would argue then freedom becomes impossible. Liberty becomes ordered liberty within a regime becomes impossible if you're all devouring each other and hurting each other.
Because at the core, and this is the most important thing about what you just said, at the core of a free society is two people coming to an agreement on how on the exchange of something. And that could be the exchange of ideas, that could be the exchange of goods, it could be the exchange of services, but two people have to agree.
Yeah.
And it's when one person doesn't have the capacity to agree to something else, that's when we start having problems of they've lost freedom. They've become a slave.
Right.
So in that sense, I hear people talking lately, and this is a really strange issue to me that it's become an issue as of late, but we seem to be hearing a growth in advocates for adult-child relationships. And this is becoming pedophilia.
Oh, goodness.
And we're hearing more.
Yeah.
Who are you to judge this adult? That's just what their preference is.
Right.
This adult prefers the company of a younger child.
Right.
That child doesn't have the experience, knowledge, education to know exactly what they're getting themselves into.
It doesn't have the capacity to reason about
and
these
it's
things.
not a reasonable mutual exchange where that child can...
It's an act of theft.
Sure.
Perverse sexuality added to it, but it's an act of theft.
And so when you talk about all of the different ways that we have to restrain ourselves, I don't really care what you say. If you say, well, that's just my preference, and who are you to judge me that's my... No, because in a free society, in a free America, in a free United States, you don't get the choice to engage in an exchange with somebody who doesn't have the choice to participate.
So we've said a few very important things here. I kind of want to summarize them. One is going back to your point that this notion of self-restraint and self-assertion, which we'll talk about next, these all kind of revolve around our individual natural rights. I should be restraining myself, governing myself in light of your rights and the rights of all of my fellow citizens, right? I am a free person. I am free to make choices and pursue happiness. But there's a big line there that I can't cross, and the line is your rights, right? I can't pursue my happiness in ways that means I take things from you or take things from other people. And here's the other important thing we're saying. We are saying that a free society, a society of liberty, it is not a place where every individual is free to do to others whatever they want. Mm-hmm. That's not what the founders meant by freedom. That's not what we mean by freedom. We're talking about a kind of ordered liberty ordered within certain moral parameters, and those parameters are set by the rights of other people. That's really important to understand those parameters, because it means there's some moral limits to our freedom, to our liberty, and that requires judgment. This is the other important point that we've just made here. We live in a world of multiculturalism and moral relativism, where this has become, now it's become so common, it's almost a cliche, right? To be non-judgmental. That, I believe, I'm curious if our listeners agree with that, in ordinary parlance, among ordinary citizens today, the word judgmental is a bad thing.
Absolutely.
That is a word you use to describe someone you don't like. Well, that person is so judgmental. I can't be friends with that person because they're judgmental. And what you and I are saying is we're trying to revive judgmentalism. We're saying it's time to be judgmental. Yeah, we need to judge what is rightful for people to do, what is the open space to go make your own choices and live life as you want, and what's the limit to judge. But you can't go past this line and make an objective judgment. That is objectively wrong to cross that line, because now all of a sudden you're violating the rights of other people. That's not your liberty. That's not your freedom. You need to restrain yourself and govern yourself.
We've blurred this line, and this is a whole tangent that we don't have the time to go down, but we've blurred that line so much because of government programs, right? There is something. I'm going to use a very simple analogy. We talked about the kid who burns his hand on the stove and says, I'm never going to do that again.
Yep.
There are those few individuals out there who say, I like the feeling of burning my hand, right? It's a little weird. I can't relate to it.
Yeah.
But we do know that there are people who engage in things like self-mutilation and self-harm. It's probably not healthy. There's probably some underlying causes that they would be better off having addressed, but there are people who enjoy engaging in that.
Right.
And to a certain extent, that should be their freedom to do, so long as it's not infringing on anybody else's liberty. We are free to judge them for it, but at the same time, that should be their freedom.
Let me put a little sharper edge on that example. I don't think it's so much about people choosing to burn their hands. How about this? They choose to have a bunch of children. A person to have a bunch of children and get themselves into terrible debt. They spend money that they don't have. And then they say, Dave, that's your responsibility to bail me out of this situation. I've got hungry kids here, Dave. Do you want my kids to go hungry? You and all your fellow citizens, you need to pony up and pay for this.
And that's where I was going with this, right? It's fine until they burn their hand and then go to the hospital and say, I don't have any money, but you got to take care of me because my hand is burnt and I need you to do something about it. Or worse, I'm going to have a lot of kids and I'm going to go on welfare, and I'm going to realize that the more kids I have, the more welfare money I'm going to get. And I don't really care if my kids get taken care of, because it's more money for me to go spend on whatever it is I want. Take it even a step further. People who want free health care, but at the same time smoke and weigh 350 pounds and eat McDonald's every day and don't exercise and don't take care of themselves and want to do all of these bad things. If that's how you want to live your life until you die, that's not my problem.
Dave, you're treading on some dangerous ground right now. I'm worried that Twitter and Facebook are all going to ban you for life. But
would that be the worst thing in the world?
But the point, look, you are speaking some really hard truths right now. They're hard and they're important truths. It is common today for our fellow citizens, our progressive fellow citizens, to tell us that We have an obligation to pay for other people's health care, to pay for other people's children, right? To provide for others who can't provide for themselves. And not only do they say it's our obligation, they shame us. Shame on you. You haven't paid your fair share. You're so greedy and you're so selfish, and you're not paying for all those other people you should be paying. You're a bad, bad person. Oh, suppose we granted that. I'll grant that argument for now. I said, okay, I have an obligation to provide for those other people, their health care, their kids. What obligation do they have to restrain themselves sexually and not produce children until they're ready to care for children?
Right.
What obligation do they have to stop smoking, to refrain from smoking, to get up in the morning and go for a walk or go to the gym or go exercise so that they're not at high risk for, cardiovascular disease? What obligation is on them? We never talk about that.
Right.
Ever. It's not even part of the conversation. It's just we have an obligation to pay for their stuff. Never a discussion about, well, what's their obligation?
Well, so pull that string a little further. The progressive argument would be they don't have an obligation. They get to do whatever makes them happy. But the government starts to realize we can't afford to pay for all of this. And what do they start doing? They start passing laws about how you have to live your life. And then they start picking and choosing who has to live that way.
Right.
This group of people is more susceptible to this disease, so they have to get tested all the time, and they have to avoid certain foods because they're more susceptible. You might have no chance of getting cancer in your entire life.
Right.
But if you're part of a group that's more susceptible, well, you're going to have to avoid, you're not allowed to eat red meat because red meat might cause cancer, and therefore you're never allowed to eat a steak.
So we're talking a little social engineering here, some central planning.
Right.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, now you have government. You no longer get to decide what's important to you.
Right.
You no longer get to decide what risks am I willing to take? What risks am I not willing to take? The government starts saying, here's who you are, here's what you're best suited for, and this is what you're going to do every day. And all of a sudden, I just gave you the basic plot of every dystopian movie and TV show that's ever been created.
Yep, that's absolutely right. Go see Hunger Games, right? Go read Orwell's 1984.
Right.
There's another piece to this conversation that is never discussed, and that is if you start with this progressive platform or the progressive premise of value relativism, it's all relative. Mm-hmm. Moral values, whatever you think is right or good, whatever you want to be. You want to smoke all the time, you smoke all the time. You want to get gorge yourself with food and get big and fat and force me to pay for your health care. You have the right to do that. That's kind of the progressive premise. You want to have a bunch of kids and you're not prepared to raise them or take care of them, and you want me to pay for it. You have the right to do that. Express yourself sexually, even if it means you produce a dozen kids that you can't care for. But here is one value that's never tolerated, never permitted, ever. What if I say, well, here's what I want to do. I don't want to smoke every day. I don't want to gorge myself and make other people pay for my health care. I don't want to produce a bunch of kids and make other people pay for it. Here's one thing I would like to do. I'd like to be productive and keep what I produce. That's my lifestyle choice.
Right.
Just don't come take my stuff away from me. That's how I choose to live within a progressive regime of central planning. That is not even considered. That's not an alternative. Absolutely not, because how are we going to pay for all these other people who have not governed themselves, who have not exercised self-restraint? By golly, we're going to come and take your stuff. You don't get to just keep the stuff that you produce.
It goes back to the same model I've talked about and I've compared the government to from day one of this podcast. We're on episode 34 now, and I think in one of the very first ones I talked about government is a mafia. Right. The government style is mafia style, and the Don will let you go do all of these other things as long as he's wetting his whistle.
Right.
But the minute he's not wetting his whistle anymore, you're public enemy number one.
Yep, that's right. So we have some citizens who want to exercise their real rights, their natural rights, their natural liberty. They want to be secure in their property.
Right.
What do they do when they're surrounded by people, some in the government, some fellow citizens, who are always trying to take their stuff. The mafia, the mafia, the government version of the mafia. There are all these mafias out there. Sometimes just individuals acting on their own, always coming and trying to hurt them, violate their rights, take their stuff. That requires citizens. Well, we have two options. The founders contemplated two options. They said one option is have a total police state.
Right.
Totalitarian police state where government watches and monitors everything to prevent all forms of crime.
How's that worked out around the world in history?
Well, and their answer was that is a remedy that's worse than the disease. It's terrible. So the other option is have a society filled with citizens who are self-assertive. That brings us to our second civic virtue.
Right.
Who are both capable and willing to stand up and assert themselves, assert their rights, protect themselves. The image always comes to my mind whenever we have this conversation about self-assertion is that old Gadsden flag, that yellow flag with the coiled up snake, don't tread on me. Don't tread on me. I might look like a peaceful, friendly guy. Most of the time I am. But if you tread on me, if you come try to step on me, if you step onto my property, if you come to take what belongs to me, I'm going to be like a venomous coiled up rattlesnake. I'm going to bite you and it's going to hurt. It might kill you. You don't want to mess with me.
Well, and so there's really three primary ways that we as citizens can engage in self-assertion or that are a part of our foundation, our precepts that we've talked about that are part of the way this country was founded. One is elections. If we're being treaded on, we elect other people. Number two is really just conversations with our neighbors, right? In that Dennis Prager piece, he talks a lot about how he's recognized and he used to travel a lot, right? Dennis Prager's been on the radio and been on television for a very, very long time.
Sure.
People know who he is. He's fairly distinct looking.
Right.
And so people see him and it's gone from walking up to him, hey, Dennis, I'm a really big fan. I'd really love to talk to you, this and that, to people wanting to walk up and whisper, hey Dennis, I like your show. Or, hey, Dennis, I'm also a Trump supporter, or I'm a Republican, or I'm a conservative. This feeling of fear. And to assert yourself is to say, I'm ready and willing to stand up to the people who try to harm me for saying something they disagree with. And then the third type is revolution, right? And that's the third and hopefully the last resort.
Right.
But really those are the three ways that our country was set up to allow us to assert ourselves when our rights are being taken from us, when we are no longer responsible for self-governance, when we are no longer responsible for restraining ourselves, and the government is restraining us from using our own private property the way we want to.
I think I would add a version, or maybe this is contained in one of those. I mean, another way that citizens assert themselves and protect their own liberty, their own property, is physically protecting their own property. A nation of virtuous citizens, what I'm about to say is going to anger a lot of people, but a nation of virtuous citizens is a nation of citizens armed to the teeth and quite able and quite willing to defend their own families, to defend their own property from any form of injustice, whether that injustice is coming from fellow citizens or from invading marauders or from their own government, which leads to the whole problem of revolution that you mentioned. But it means really asserting that this is my property, this is my home, this is my free life. You're not going to come and take my stuff or hurt me.
And then this goes back to your conversation at the very beginning of this conversation about Nicomachean ethics, about how they're contained within one another.
Right.
That self-assertion also requires self-restraint.
Yes.
It requires knowing when to use it. If you are going to have every citizen armed to the teeth, you don't want every citizen, every time they're upset, running out their front door, shooting their guns and going crazy. It's an analogy that you and I use all the time, and that's of the skilled boxer or the skilled fighter who has that ability to land a strike that will just knock the other person out.
Right.
But they don't just try to use it every time, and they don't go all in every single time, and they're not just on full out attack all the time.
How do they, I have in my mind, I'm picturing some like top level martial artist who's really, really good. How did that fighter get to that place?
Practice.
Right. This reinforces this theme of these things aren't easy, right? You don't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to be a top level fighter. No, you have to practice. Same thing with being a self-assertive citizen. What's the right way to assert yourself in this situation or in that situation, right? Being in a town hall meeting where some unjust legislation is being proposed, that's a very different situation than someone breaking into your house in the middle of the night, right? You don't respond the same way. So you need to be able to reflect. You need some judgment. You need some calculation. You need to strategize. You need to be restrained enough to look at what's going on and think, right? And make a judgment. So self-assertion contains within itself this idea of self-restraint. They're intrinsically connected together.
Right.
And it kind of leads, and maybe this is a good transition. We might have to save the rest of the other two virtues for the next podcast. But here's maybe how we can transition in. When do you need to assert yourself? What is a threat to your rights and what is not a threat? Well, that kind of depends on what your rights are and what your rights are not. And we'll do a little cliffhanger here for our listeners. I'm going to lay out 3 buckets of rights, 3 possible kinds of rights, 3 labels of rights, and then we'll pick this back up and fill in the bucket.
You're taking me back to my days in accounting class when my tax professor would say, "There's 3 buckets.
3 buckets.
Which does the cost fall in?"
So there are 3 buckets of rights. There are natural rights. The founders talked a lot about natural rights. There are civil rights, and there are economic rights or entitlements. And these things are not the same. And we need to know what those rights are, which means we need some civic knowledge in order to know when to assert ourselves and when not. And I think we'll have to pick that up in our next podcast.
I think that's a great place to start next week.
Okay.
Until then, no sumus custodes. We will remain the guardians.
Hear, hear.